They say it started in a hotel lobby, a desperate woman, a powerful stranger. But that's not true, because the man sitting across from me, Hajun, doesn't believe in coincidences. And the way he looked at me that night, like he already knew how my story would end, it still keeps me awake. What I didn't know then, I wasn't asking a stranger for help. I was stepping into a plan that had already begun a year before I ever said his name. The air in the Grand Hyatt didn't just feel expensive, it felt predatory. I stood there, clutching a wedding invitation that felt like a death warrant, my dignity fraying at the edges. Minsu had moved on to a suitable bride, leaving me to haunt the ruins of our 3-year ghost story. I needed a miracle, or a very convincing lie. That's when I saw him. Hajun was a silhouette of sharp charcoal wool and cold, a dangerous stillness. He wasn't just sitting in that corner booth. He owned the shadows around it. When I approached, the scent of expensive bourbon and something darker, something like old memories, hit me. My voice was a thin wire about to snap. Will you be my date? Just for one night, to show them I'm not as broken as they think. He didn't blink. He didn't laugh. He simply set his glass down, the ice clinking like a final gavel. His gaze swept over me, not with pity, but with a terrifying, ancient recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, velvet vibration that seemed to pull the very air out of my lungs. I don't play games, Vivian, but for you, I'll make an exception. As his hand settled on the small of my back, heavy, warm, and possessive, the world outside that lobby ceased to exist. I thought I was hiring a savior to help me survive my ex's wedding. I had no idea I was walking straight into the arms of the man who had been waiting for me to break, just so he could be the one to piece me back together. The invitation sat on my coffee table like a silent, elegant threat. It was a heavy, ivory-pressed slab of cardstock that smelled faintly of expensive jasmine, the kind of scent that sticks to your throat and makes it impossible to swallow. Minsu Lee hadn't just sent a wedding invite, he'd sent a polished, gold-foiled weapon. Across the top, his name sat entwined with Sora Yoon's in a delicate, mocking script. Sora, the socially suitable choice, the woman who didn't have to learn the complex etiquette of Seoul's elite because she was born breathing it. I traced the embossed letters until my fingertip went numb. Every curve of the font screamed what Minsu hadn't the courage to say to my face. You weren't enough, Vivian. You were a beautiful distraction, but she fits the frame. The silence in my apartment felt hollow, amplified by the distant rhythmic hum of the city outside. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. An American art consultant who had traded her life for a man who chose a merger over a soulmate. My chest tightened, a familiar, dull ache blooming behind my ribs. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was the looming shadow of the wedding day, where I was expected to sit in the third row and smile while they paraded my replacement. Sora was everything I wasn't in their world, predictable, connected, and safe. She was the perfect bride for a man building an empire, while I was the foreigner who asked too many questions and laughed too loudly. The invitation was a formal eviction notice from the life I thought we were building together. I should just rent a boyfriend, I whispered to the empty room, the words tasting like copper and bitter irony. A 6-foot-tall distraction with a black card and a lethal smile. Someone to make them all forget I was ever the girl who didn't belong. I let out a sharp, jagged laugh that died in my throat. It was a joke, a desperate, pathetic punchline to a life that had suddenly gone off script. I didn't know then that the universe had stopped laughing. I didn't know that 3 blocks away, in a penthouse wrapped in glass and steel, a man was closing a folder with my name on it, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw in a photograph with a terrifying, quiet intent. I wouldn't have to rent a hero. I was about to invite a storm into my life, and for the first time since landing in Korea, I didn't care if it leveled everything I had built. The lobby of the Grand Hyatt was an altar of cold marble and filtered light, a place where the air tasted of expensive perfume and quiet, terrifying power. I stood in the center of the vast floor, the wedding invitation a jagged weight in my pocket, my pulse a frantic, trapped thing against my ribs. I felt exposed, a smudge of desperation on a masterpiece of high society perfection. Then I saw him. He wasn't just sitting in the corner booth. He had carved a sanctuary out of the shadows. Hajun, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms like a prayer or a curse. He wore a charcoal suit that looked less like clothing and more like armor, and tailored to a body that moved with the lethal grace of a predator. He wasn't looking at his drink. He was looking at me, not with curiosity, but with a steady, unwavering focus that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. The distance between us felt like a physical barrier, charged with a sudden, unexplainable static. I moved before my pride could stop me, each step a defiance of the shame Minsu had left behind. When I reached his table, the scent of him hit me, sandalwood, aged bourbon, and the crisp, ozone chill of a coming storm. My voice was a thin, trembling wire as I broke the silence. Will you be my date? To a wedding where I'm supposed to be the ghost? The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to drown in. I expected a laugh, a dismissive wave of a hand that could buy and sell my entire life. Instead, Hajun leaned forward, the movement slow and deliberate. He studied me, his dark eyes tracing the line of my jaw, the frantic pulse at my throat, and the unshed anger in my stare. He looked at me like I was a puzzle he'd already solved a year ago. "You're asking the wrong question, Vivian," he whispered, his voice a low, velvet vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and strike straight at my marrow. He didn't move, yet I felt crowded by his presence, the air between us vibrating with a sudden, dangerous heat. He wasn't just agreeing, he was claiming the space. A beat of silence stretched, agonizing and intimate, before he spoke again. "The real question is, why me?" My breath hitched. My pulse didn't just stutter, it went wild. There was something in the way he said my name, a familiar cadence, a weight of history I couldn't place. Shagged in that moment, the hotel lobby faded into a blur of light and shadow. There was only the heat radiating from him and the terrifying realization that I hadn't just found a stranger to help me. I had stepped into the orbit of a man who had been waiting for me to look his way. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check a calendar or consult a subordinate. He simply watched me, his silence a heavy physical thing that seemed to press the air right out of my lungs. I reached for my purse, ready to negotiate a price for his time, to turn this desperation into a transaction I could understand, but he stopped me with a single sharp motion of his hand. He didn't want my money. That realization sent a cold shiver of suspicion down my spine, a dark, noir-tinged doubt that whispered of hidden motives. A man like Hajun doesn't trade in charity. He trades in assets. I was a stranger to him, yet he was looking at me like he'd already factored my existence into his net worth. "If I do this," he began, his voice dropping to a low, velvet rasp that vibrated in the small space between us. "You don't get to fall apart halfway. At that wedding, you aren't just a guest. You're mine. And I don't lose." The word mine hung in the air, thick and possessive, colonizing the silence of the lobby. Before I could find my breath, he reached out. It was a calculated intrusion. His fingers brushed against my wrist, a brief searing contact that lingered far longer than necessary, his skin a localized fire against my freezing pulse. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, his hand hovering near the hollow of my throat before settling to adjust the silk of my sleeve. It was an entirely unnecessary gesture, intentional, intimate, and designed to remind me exactly who was in control of this shadow play. I forced myself to meet his gaze, refusing to look away, even as my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. His eyes were dark pools of ancient recognition, studying my defiance as if it were the most exquisite thing he'd ever seen. I felt stripped bare, not of my clothes, but of my secrets. He was looking through the art consultant, through the jilted ex-girlfriend, and straight into the woman who was tired of being small. The air between us was so thick with tension, it felt like a physical weight, a magnetic pull that threatened to drag me into his orbit before I even knew the stakes of the game. "I don't fall apart," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, my chin lifting to meet the challenge in his stare. I met his predatory focus with a cold, quiet strength that I hadn't felt in months. "Not anymore," my inner voice whispered, a hard, jagged promise. Hajun's lips curved into the ghost of a smile, something satisfied and deeply dangerous. He stood up, his massive frame eclipsing the amber light of the lobby, and offered me his arm. The deal was sealed, not with a contract or a signature, but with a touch that felt like a brand on my soul. As I took his arm, the heat of his body seeped through my layers, a terrifyingly solid reminder that I hadn't just hired an actor. I had stepped into the cage with a lion, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave. The transition from an apartment that smelled of rejection to the plush, leather-scented interior of Hajun's Maybach felt like crossing a border into a country where I actually mattered. We spent the following days in a blur of curated appearances, dress fittings in private ateliers, where the seamstresses bowed as if he were royalty, and quiet car rides through the neon-drenched veins of Seoul. Every moment was a lesson in his brand of power, but it was the details he shouldn't have known that started to unravel me. At dinner, he didn't ask. He simply ordered the 2015 Cabernet I'd once mentioned in an obscure interview 3 years ago. When we walked through the gallery district, he didn't just nod at the walls. He spoke about my past exhibitions with a clinical, reverent precision that made my breath hitch. "You prefer the lighting at the 2023 showcase," he murmured, his voice a low, velvet brush against my ear as he adjusted the silk of my wrap. It highlighted the struggle in the brushwork, just like you're doing now. I froze, the air between us suddenly too thin to breathe. How did a man who moved billions find the time to memorize the footnotes of my career? It wasn't just his knowledge. It was the way his presence began to feel like a physical weight, anchoring me to a reality I wasn't sure was still a lie. During a gala preview, a young gallerist leaned in too close, his hand hovering near my waist as he spiraled into a practiced, arrogant flirtation. Hajun didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply stepped into the light, his shadow swallowing the other man whole. He didn't even look at the interloper. He just settled his hand on the small of my back, warm, heavy, and utterly final. She's with me," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact stated with the same quiet authority he used to close a hostile takeover. The gallerist vanished into the crowd, leaving me leaning into the solid, rhythmic heat of Hajun's chest. For a heartbeat, the fake part of our deal felt like a distant, flickering lie. My pulse didn't just stutter, it sang a song of recognition. I looked up at the sharp, unforgiving line of his jaw and felt a terrifying pull in my chest. Why did his possession feel more like a homecoming than a performance? He wasn't just playing the part of a lover. He was looking at me as if I were the only masterpiece in a room full of sketches. His voice would drop an octave every time he said my name, turning a simple noun into a heavy, intimate vow. And for the first time, I wasn't just surviving the memory of Min Soo. I was drowning in the reality of Hajun. I watched him as he spoke to a diplomat, his eyes never truly leaving mine, even across the room. The suspicion I had carried since the lobby began to mutate into something far more dangerous. A desperate need to know why a man like him had been keeping track of a woman like me. Every coincidence was a brick in a wall he'd been building around us for a long time. Why does this feel so real? I asked myself. The answer a terrifying whisper in the back of my mind that I wasn't ready to hear. The night before the wedding, the air in the penthouse felt thin, overcharged with the static of a storm that refused to break. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the neon veins of soul pulse below, my reflection a pale, trembling ghost against the dark. And on the mahogany door, the gown hung like a shroud of my former self, a masterpiece of silk and lace that was supposed to be my armor, but currently felt like a lie I wasn't strong enough to tell. My lungs were tight, compressed by a sudden, suffocating urge to vanish before the sun rose on the theater of my humiliation. I didn't hear him enter. I only felt the shift in the room, the way the atmosphere suddenly centered around a single, magnetic point. Hajun didn't speak at first. He simply stood behind me, his reflection overlapping mine on the glass, a shadow that felt more solid than the floor beneath my feet. The heat radiating from his chest was a silent command to stay grounded, a barrier between me and the abyss of my own doubt. "You're shaking, Vivian," he murmured, his voice a low, a velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate through my very spine. "I can't do it," I whispered, the admission tearing at my throat like jagged glass. "Minsu, the cameras, the whispers, it's all just a performance. I'm just a girl playing dress-up in your world, hoping no one notices I don't belong." He moved then, closing the sliver of space between us until I could feel the rhythmic, powerful thrum of his heart against my shoulder blades. He didn't wrap his arms around me. He simply existed in my space, his presence an absolute. He reached around, his hand moving with agonizing slowness, until his thumb found the frantic, leaping pulse at my wrist. He didn't grab me, he anchored me. The contact was searing, a localized fire that made the rest of the world go cold. "Look at me," he commanded softly. I turned in the small circle of his power. Hush-shrang, my breath hitching as I met a gaze that wasn't clinical or calculating. It was hungry. It was ancient. "You're not doing this for him anymore, are you? This isn't about the man who was too blind to keep you." I shook my head, unable to find my voice in the wreckage of my pride. The silence between us stretched, heavy and intimate, filled with the things we hadn't dared to put into our agreement. His thumb traced a slow, possessive stroke over the delicate skin of my inner wrist, a gesture so tender it was violent. "Then, don't run," he whispered, his face inches from mine, his scent of cedar and rain-drenched earth clouding my senses until I forgot how to breathe. "Stay, for me." My breath caught in a jagged sob I refused to let out. In that moment, the jagged pieces of my broken identity finally went still. I realized with a terrifying clarity that the revenge I'd craved was gone, replaced by a yearning that had no business being part of a deal. The fake had burned away, leaving only this, the heat of his skin, the weight of his stare, and the realization that I wasn't going to that wedding to survive my past. I was going because I had finally found a reason to walk into the future. This stopped being a game a long time ago. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom didn't just open, they surrendered. The air inside, thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of old money, went dead silent as we crossed the threshold. It was a physical blow, the collective gasp of Soul's elite hitting us like a wave. I felt every eye in the room, 1,000 needles of judgment, pivot from the altar to the woman they had prepared to pity. Hajun didn't break stride. His hand settled on the small of my back, a warm, possessive anchor that told the room I wasn't an intruder. I was the event. The charcoal wool of his sleeve brushed against my bare skin, a searing reminder that I wasn't walking alone into this lion's den. He moved with a lethal, quiet grace, his presence effectively erasing the opulence of the chandeliers. I saw Minsu first. His face went through a violent transformation, from smug groom to a man who had just seen a ghost draped in diamonds. The champagne glass in his hand drifted, forgotten, as his gaze traveled from my heels to the man towering beside me. Next to him, Sora Yoon's porcelain mask fractured. Her practiced bridal smile didn't reach her eyes, which were suddenly wide with the realization that the socially inferior ex-girlfriend had just walked in with the one man her father couldn't intimidate. The tension was a cord pulled to the snapping point. As we moved through the crowd, Hajun's thumb traced a slow, rhythmic circle against my waist, a subtle, dominant claim that required no words. He wasn't just escorting me. He was shielding me with his shadow, claiming my space in this world as absolute. Then, the moment I'd replayed in my nightmares finally arrived. Minsu intercepted us near the terrace, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. He ignored Hajun, his eyes frantic as they searched mine for a flicker of the girl he'd discarded. He caught my elbow, pulling me just inches away from the music, his grip tight and trembling. "Was I really that easy to replace, Vivian?" he hissed, his voice cracking with a bruised ego that he mistook for passion. "To bring him here of all people. Is this just a stunt to hurt me?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized the monster I'd feared was just a small man in a very expensive suit. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned in, the silk of my gown whispering against the air, my scent of jasmine and confidence filling the space between us. "No, Minsu," I said, my voice as cold and clear as the winter moon. "You weren't easy to replace. You were just that easy to outgrow." I turned back to Hajun, whose dark eyes were fixed on Minsu with a lethal, quiet promise. When I slipped my hand back into his, the heat of his palm felt like a sanctuary. I wasn't looking for an exit anymore. I was exactly where I belonged. The car was a silent, leather-scented sanctuary as the neon blur of Seoul streaked past the tinted glass. The adrenaline that had carried me through the ballroom was fading, leaving a hollow, aching vulnerability in its wake. Hajun sat beside me, his profile a sharp, unforgiving silhouette against the city lights. He hadn't let go of my hand. His thumb was still tracing that slow, hypnotic circle against my skin, a rhythmic claim that made my heart hammer for an entirely new reason. Why? The word was a fragile thread in the quiet of the cabin. I turned to him, my chest tight. "You could have had anyone. You could have been anywhere else tonight. Why did you really say yes to a stranger in a lobby?" The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, like the air before a tectonic shift. Wari Hajun didn't look at me at first. He watched the rain begin to smear the window, his jaw tight. Then he turned. The intensity in his dark eyes was enough to stop my breath. It wasn't the gaze of a man who had just finished a business transaction. It was the look of a man who had finally reached the end of a very long journey. "Because it wasn't the first time I saw you, Vivian," he whispered. The world seemed to tilt. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. I searched his face, my mind racing through the last few days, looking for the lie, but there was only a raw, terrifying sincerity. "A year ago," he continued, his voice dropping to that low, velvet rasp that made my skin prickle. "A small gallery in Insadong. You were standing in front of a canvas of chaotic blue strokes. You were wearing a white coat, and you looked, Ivor I fake exhausted. But then someone asked you about the piece, and you laughed. It was a sharp, honest sound that didn't belong in a room full of curated pretension. You didn't see me in the corner. You didn't notice the man who stopped breathing just to hear that laugh again. I felt the blood drain from my face. I remembered that night. I remembered feeling so invisible, so lost in the shadow of Minsu's expectations. I had no idea I was being memorized. "I watched you for an hour," he confessed, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around mine. "I saw how you touched the frames when you thought no one was looking. I saw the way you owned that room without even trying. I spent the next 12 months looking for an opening, a reason to step into your orbit without scaring you away." He leaned in, his scent, sandalwood and cold rain, enveloping me, erasing the memory of the wedding, the ex, and the shame. "So when you walked up to me in that lobby, looking like you were ready to set the world on fire just to stay warm, I wasn't agreeing to help you, Vivian." He paused, his gaze dropping to my lips before locking back onto my eyes with a predatory kind of devotion. I was taking my chance. I was making sure that this time, you wouldn't be the one to walk away. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The fake date, the curated wine, the knowledge of my career. It wasn't research. It was a year of silent, disciplined longing. I wasn't his project. I was his prize. The air in the car was no longer thick with the ghosts of my past. It was heavy with the staggering reality of his confession. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was a living, breathing thing, vibrating with the energy of a year's worth of unspoken longing. I looked at Hajun, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the billionaire or the CEO or the man who had bought my dignity back from the Lee family. I saw a man who had stood in the shadows of a dusty gallery and waited for me to notice him. The revenge I'd craved, the look on Minsu's face, the social victory, the crushing of Sora's ego, it all felt like ash in my mouth. It was small. It was insignificant. Because while I had been obsessing over a man who thought I wasn't enough, Hajun had been building a pedestal for me in his mind. I wasn't thinking about Minsu anymore. I wasn't thinking about the wedding or the invitations or the rules of a society that didn't want me. I was thinking about the heat of Hajun's hand and the way his voice broke just a fraction when he admitted he'd been watching me. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the sharp, clean line of his jaw. The stubble was a slight friction against my skin, grounding me in the present. I didn't want the performance anymore. I wanted the truth. So, I whispered, my breath ghosting against his lips. Was any of it fake? The car? The dresses? The way you looked at me when the cameras were off? Hajun didn't answer with words. He leaned in, closing the final inch between us until I could feel the erratic, powerful thud of his heart against my own. He moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation, his hand sliding up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb anchoring me to him. Only the part, he breathed, his voice a dark, velvet confession against my skin, where I pretended not to want you before that night in the lobby. Everything else, every touch, every look, every word, that was the only real thing I've felt in years. When he kissed me, it wasn't the polite, staged kiss of a fake boyfriend. It was a claim. It was a release of 12 months of disciplined restraint. It tasted like rain and silk and a future I hadn't dared to imagine. In the quiet of the moving car, surrounded by the neon glow of a city that suddenly felt like home, I let go of the girl who was not enough. I chose him, fully, intentionally, and without the safety net of a contract. I slipped my fingers through his, locking our hands together. It wasn't the heavy grip of possession I had feared. It was the steady, equal weight of a choice, a partnership. They say it started in a hotel lobby, a desperate woman and a powerful stranger. But the truth? It started the moment he saw me standing in front of a blue canvas, exhausted and laughing, and decided, right then, that I was worth waiting for.